Ladies and gentlemen, the graduation ceremony of Daniel Maramba National High School for the school year 2020-2021.
Friends, the Philippine National Anthem, Opening Prayer, Regional Hymn, and Pangasinan Hymn.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Dear Lord, we ask for your almighty hand be with us, the graduates of Batch 2021, our families, and all the faculty and administrative members as we celebrate this milestone. Bless and guide us as we reach this end and enter new beginnings and opportunities. Bless our lives from this day forward with success and perseverance. Allow us to keep our dreams alive for your greater glory. Allow us to keep our dreams alive for your greater glory, to recognize what is good and just, to make good use of our talents and abilities, and to serve others. Today, we also pray for tomorrow. This graduation marks the beginning of another chapter. Lead us now into the future as you had in the past. On the challenges of our learning setup, give us focus, as well as a call from you to realize our purpose and the courage to respond and step forward to that calling. Dear Lord, show us your favor. Keep us safe at all times, and may your guidance be with us in every path we choose to take. Amen.
And the rivers, through the plains and winding trails, to the shores where breezes linger. That's the place I love so well. It's the home of men who love her, men who died to keep us free, men who told no bad the weather, that anyone will never be. Region 1, oh Region 1, there's no better place I see. Region 1, oh Region 1, dearest home by far to me. From her care I learn my lessons, in her veils I work and pray. She has kept me safe and happy as I live on day by day. From to other lands I wander as I search for wealth and fame. In my heart I will remember Region 1, beloved name. Region 1, oh Region 1, there's no better place I see. Region 1, oh Region 1, dearest so my far to be. Matandayumi, Pangasinan niya binabli. Daan mo kami aligwas, iuragod ko lawas. Nagpusong Pangasinan, agkanalingwanan. Luyak ko yan iyanagan, bedegdakan yaman. Mangkuan naligwas mula tayanan nila, kasing maluring mapula. Say pangkakasat tinatay nalilit na, labot ka na mabresika. Say dayak mundak na'y datuktan sa yaman, sagdan na kapalan ngayon. Karoon ang tansamping mo Pangasinan, pagyan talawas Bantayan. Lawas takan itang duro Pangasinan, harun kakang bayumuan. Panang ako kung yawala na bangunan, ikikinon ko siyo paman. Pangasinan, luyang minagyaman.
Words of welcome by our school principal, Dr. Olivia P. Terrado.
Graduation greetings to the hard-working teachers and personnel of the Daniel Maramba National High School, the proud parents, and graduating class of Batch 2020-2021. Graduation is a great present in this time of pandemic. It is with remarkable pride that I commend everyone for a delightful school year 2020-2021. With that, much salutations to your honored parents, for they have been the sun, the water, and the wind beneath your wings. They have been your strength as warriors to reach this graduation. The sacrifices all you have made have been paid off. With the situation that we are in today, and with the chosen learning modalities, you, our graduates of today, are survivors. You are the tiny flowers in the forest, enduring and blooming through all the seasons of the year. Truly, indeed, that you have bloomed to where you are planted. To the graduates of Batch 2020-2021, let us see the world as God's garden, and each individual being a diverse kind of flower, augmenting the variety and beauty which Jesus delighted in. Congratulations, warriors!
Presentation of candidates for graduation by our school principal, Dr. Olivia P. Tirado, and confirmation and acceptance of graduates by our public schools district supervisor, Dr. Diana C. Baguio.
Madam, in my capacity as the principal of Daniel Maramba National High School, I have the honor to present to you 695 graduates, 334 of whom are males and 361 are females for school year 2020-2021. They have satisfactorily completed the requirements prescribed by the Department of Education under the K-12 Basic Education curriculum. I therefore recommend they will be confirmed graduates.
By the power vested in me by the school's division superintendent, and acting upon the recommendation of your principal, that you have successfully completed the requirements prescribed by the Department of Education under the K-12 Basic Education curriculum, I, Diana C. Baguio, Public Schools District Supervisor, hereby confirm your graduation rights and declare you senior high school graduates of Daniel Maramba National High School today. I therefore confer upon you all the rights and privileges thereto appertain. Congratulations.
The inspirational message of our DepEd Secretary, Secretary Leonor Magtolis Briones.
Good day to each and everyone who is attending virtually present at this time of our graduation ceremonies for our beloved and very precious graduates. This year, your role has changed drastically, where we've always believed that the matter of educating our children rests nearly exclusively on our teachers and our staff. This time, you parents, you family members, you who are in the households of our learners have expanded your role and contributed to this wonderful day, wherein finally, our learners are graduating in this culmination exercise. So congratulations, because this year has not been very easy, has not been a picnic for our teachers, for our family members, as well, especially the parents, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, and all who have contributed to the achievement of our learners at this time. So, maraming salamat at congratulations, parents and family members. Mas malaki ang role ninyo at this time compared to earlier graduation exercises. Secondly, I would also like to greet our teachers, without whose very careful review and careful supervision of the work of our pupils and our learners, this event would not be taking place at all. And so thank you, teachers. Your role has also expanded, in addition to seeing to it that the modules are faithfully followed, the assignments are correctly implemented, and the learners from those which are used to. Assessment must have been especially difficult for you, especially since you were not able to see most of the time our students in face-to-face meetings, and most of the meetings, of course, were virtual. We'd also like to thank the local government units for their interest, for their cooperation, and for their continuing contributions to the needs of education, even as our children do not go to school. Your donations of material as well as financial resources at this time are most welcome, and your advice has been taken seriously, not only by our teachers, by our school officials, but also by our officials in the Department of Education. We continually talk with local government units, especially in times of disaster, in times of great need for classrooms, for space, and for responses to unforeseen emergencies. Thank you, local government units. But of course, most of the congratulatory greetings fall on the deserving graduate Each and every one of you is truly special. You are different from the other graduates who have passed through the portals of your school. You went to school practically without seeing your teachers, if at all. You went to school with your parents, your mothers, and your fathers hovering over your shoulders and seeing to it that you are able to complete your assignments. You are completing your studies at a time when examinations and assessments are different. You are culminating these long months of hard work at this time, even as you have to do family chores, even as you are distracted, and even as your world has turned upside down, and it seems and it appears as if we don't know what the future holds and what will happen next. But you have persevered, and now you are ready to graduate. And therefore, you deserve each and every bit of congratulations from us in the Department of Education, from your parents and family members, your teachers, from the officials in local government, as well as in the Parent Teachers Associations. You deserve each and every single congratulatory pat on your back, each hug, virtually, of course, and each greeting, which I am sure you are also receiving virtually. I don't know if you will remember this event many years from now. I have tried to recall myself who our graduation speaker was when I finished high school and when I finished my college studies. All I remember is that the graduation speaker was someone important, someone who was invited because that someone is supposed to give a message. What was more important to us graduates at that time was the excitement of the celebrations, the happiness and the joy of our parents, the sadness of parting from our classmates and from our teachers, and the enjoyment of all the graduation events that usually take place come commencement day. When I was a college student, we had a series of events which were designed to embed in our minds, which were designed to help us remember and not forget our days in college. We would spend one whole day going around the campus, visiting the classrooms, saying goodbye to our teachers, and sharing memories. We would have bonfires to say goodbye to each other. We had baccalaureate services where we committed ourselves to God and we prayed for guidance when we go out into the world. So many celebrations, and the speaker, of course, is the least important and easily forgotten component of the graduation exercise. Nonetheless, I will exert all efforts to share with you what I see are things or issues which a graduate should remember and recall. I have said that you are very special. You are very different. You are pioneering. There has been no other class like your class. There has been no other graduate like you. as a graduating student because you are the very first graduate of the blended learning response to education in the Philippines. And so you ask yourself, what awaits you in the world outside? You can either work because the kind of curriculum you survived and underwent as a student will enable you to go to work if you wish to go to work. Some of you will proceed to further studies, and this would be a wonderful thing because there are many opportunities for further expanding your knowledge, for further answering and looking for explanations of issues, events that make you curious, especially in science, in technology, and also in the arts. So you can work, you can go to further studies, and perhaps some of you will settle down, hopefully not too soon, so you can pursue what you really want to do. So today, this is why we call this exercise a commencement exercise. It's not the end of our studies. It's not the end of all our efforts with blended learning, with modules, with floods, with earthquakes, and of course with COVID. It's a commencement of doors opening to you. More doors will be opened because you are a graduate. You can work, you can proceed for further studies, you can help your parents, and you can perhaps look for opportunities to do what you have always wanted to do, whether at work, know more about this world, and the door which will allow you to contribute to the development of our country and contribute whatever we can to solve our problems and our challenges. Congratulations once more to each and every one of you. Congratulations to you, parents and family members. Congratulations to you, teachers. When I was chair of the board of Silliman University, each time we had graduation ceremonies during the baccalaureate and during commencement itself, I would cry. I would cry because you are sending out into the world a new batch of graduates, and we want to be sure that what is awaiting them is appropriate. We want to be sure that they are ready for what awaits them when they select which door to open. And so we tell you, go out to the world, do whatever you want to do. God be with you, and be assured that all of us love each and every one of you. Congratulations.
2021. Graduation and moving up ceremonies are the much-awaited events in the life of every learner, as they represent the golden times of reaching higher education and achieving dreams and aspirations. Indeed, finishing this challenging school year during these trying times of COVID-19 pandemic is remarkable, since it has been inevitable to face and accept the new normal landscape of education. It has been a school year of extraordinary hard work, dedication, and passion for all school leaders, teachers, and parents in dealing and coping with chosen learning delivery modality to meet most essential educational requirements. Likewise, the incessant motivation and support of parents towards the seemingly thorny road to success caused by the global health crisis, as well as the strict obedience to various health and safety protocols, have enormously pinched into this moment of your graduation and completion. My dear graduates and completers, you have just marked another significant milestone in your continued quest for excellence and successful future. Certainly, more challenges will still come your way. However, stay focused and always remember that your dream is within reach when you are determined and committed. My beloved parents, accept my heartfelt gratitude. Thank you for being an effective and efficient partner of the DepEd in the implementation of distance learning. Your untiring support is a deeper reflection of your unconditional love you bestowed to the learners through the years. Undoubtedly, you have greatly contributed to the fulfillment of the mandate of the DepEd, Sulong Edukalidad. My sincere commendations to all the school administrators, faculty members, and non-teaching staff for providing the highest degree of service para sa bata, para sa bayan. Finally, with this happy celebration of your graduation and completion, it is with confidence to say that you have given our theme for this year, strengthening the quality of education amid the COVID-19 pandemic, a very special meaning. Congratulations and have a wonderful graduation day and moving up ceremony. The message of our Officer in Charge, Schools Division Superintendent, Dr. Ellie S. Obaldo.
Isang mapagpalang araw sa inyong lahat. Lubos ang aking kagalakan na makapagbigay ng mensahe sa inyo, mahal naming mga magulang, guro, punong guro, at higit sa lahat, sa inyo, ating mga completers at graduates mula sa kindergarten, grade 6, grade 10, grade 12, at sa ating learners from the alternative learning system na pumasa sa portfolio assessment. Ang tema ng ating end of school year rites ay kalidad ng edukasyon lalong patatagin sa gitna ng pandemya. Ang pandemyang dulot ng COVID-19 ang nag-udyok sa lahat ng educational leaders na gumawa ng mga tough choices sa gitna ng tanong, paano mapapangalagaan ang kaligtasan ng mga guro at paano maihahatid ang edukasyon sa mga mag-aaral. Ayon nga kay Secretary Briones, education must continue even in times of crisis. Sa pagtutulungan nga ng mga magulang, mag-aaral, kaguruan at stakeholders na itawid natin ang school year 2020-2021. Tunay ngang napakahalaga ng ating selebrasyon ngayong school year 2020-2021 because for the first time in history, the school and home have finally touched base together for a common aspiration. Nagpapatunay na malaki ang bahagi ng parental involvement sa academic achievement ng isang mag-aaral. As parents and teachers work together to address our children's needs, we're able to form a formidable team to combat ignorance and keep relevant values that every home and society cherish. Batid ko ang inyong mga pasakit at pinagdaanan maitawid lamang ang inyong pag-aaral. Mental stress, dala ng independent learning, unstable internet connectivity, problema sa kahirapan ng buhay. Ngunit lahat ng ito ay napagtagumpayan ninyo. Ang inyong ipinakitang tibay ay kamangha-mangha. Ito ay nagpapakita ng katatagan ng ating mga mag-aaral. Lastly, gusto kong sabihin sa inyo, please appreciate your parents. To be a good father and mother requires that the parents defer many of their own needs and desires in favor of the needs of their children. You never know what sacrifices they went through for you. Respect your teachers. Teachers spend most of their nights planning, most of their mornings explaining, most of their afternoons correcting, most of their years encouraging, most of their lives stressing what matters most in life, and it's all for your future. So don't make their jobs more difficult. Congratulations to you, our precious children, parents, teachers, and school heads, for continuously making the flames of education burn amidst the darkness of these times. Mabuhay!
The message of our Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Diana C. Baguio.
Isa sa pinakamahalaga at masayang araw sa buhay ng mga magulang ay ang makita ang kanilang anak na magtapos at tanggapin ang kanyang diploma. Dahil ito ay simbolo ng kanilang matagumpay na pakikibaka sa lahat ng hirap at pagsubok na kanilang napagdaanan sa panahon ng kanilang pag-aaral. Masaya sila na sa wakas ay nagkaroon ng bunga ang lahat ng kanilang mga sakripisyo, mabigyan lamang ng magandang kinabukasan ang kanilang mga anak. Marahil may kaunting kalungkutan sa bawat mga magulang, lalo na sa inyong mga magsisipagtapos, sapagkat hindi nila mararanasan ang kinagawiang graduation rites na kung saan aakyat sila ng entablado kasama ang kanilang anak dahil sa krisis na dulot ng COVID-19. Naiintindihan natin ang kanilang damdamin. Ngunit, huwag nating kalimutan na hindi mabubura ng sitwasyong ito ang maluwalhati ninyong maitaguyod ang isang yugto ng inyong buhay, ang matagumpay ninyong pagtatapos. Sa lahat ng magsisipagtapos sa panuroang taong 2020-2021, tanggapin ninyo ang taus-puso kong pagbati sapagkat napagtagumpayan ninyo ang hamon na dulot ng pandemyang ating dinaranas. Kasabay ng aking pagbati ang panalangin sa Diyos na nawa ay patuloy niya kayong labayan sa pagharap sa pagbagong yugto ng inyong pag-aaral tungo sa pagtupad ng inyong mga pangarap. Sa lahat ng mga magulang na malugod na nagsakripisyo, hindi lamang para may taguyod ang pag-aaral ng inyong anak, kundi nagsilbi at tumayo rin kayo bilang pangalawa nilang guro. Maraming salamat dahil kayo ang nagsilbing matatag naming katuwang upang may pagpatuloy ang edukasyon sa panahon ng pandemya. Alam naming hindi naging madali sa inyo ang lahat, ngunit malugod ninyong tinanggap ang hamon. Saludo po ako sa inyo lahat. Sa buong kaguruan ng Santa Barbara 1 District, kasama ang ating 13 magigiting na school heads, teaching and non-teaching personnel, maraming salamat muli sa isang taong hindi matatawarang sakripisyo para maitawid at matapos ang panuroang taong ito. Napakaraming pagsubok at hamon ang inyong hinarap, ngunit hindi kayo sumuko at nanatili kayong matatag dahil sa inyong pagmamahal sa sinumpaan ninyong tungkulin para sa bata, para sa bayan. Sa lahat po ng bumubuo ng Santa Barbara Local Government Unit, Municipal Mayor, Vice Mayor, Sangguniang Bayan members, Barangay officials,
PTA officers at members, supportive stakeholders from government and private organizations. Maraming salamat po sa lahat ng inyong suporta. Ang pinakamataas na pasasalamat at papuri ay binabalik ko sa ating Panginoong may kapal na siyang naging dahilan kung bakit napagtagumpayan natin lahat ng hamon at pagsubok na ating pinagdaanan. Naway patuloy niya tayong akayin sa daang ating panglalakbayin bilang bahagi ng ating. Congratulations, Batch 2020-2021 graduates!
Ladies and gentlemen, the graduates and awardees of Daniel Maramba National High School for the school year 2020-2021.
Here are the graduates of Accountancy, Business, and Management, 12 Deloitte, under the advisory of Mr. John Roland de Guzman. Laika Jane M. Acosta with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel R. Acosta. Tricia C. Arenas with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renelito T. Arenas. Defaline M. Ballesteros with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Defrey G. Ballesteros. Denise Joy P. Balolo with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo M. Balolo. Rhea E. Barberan with honors. Parent, Mr. Rodolfo N. Barberan. Abigail P. Batistiana with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger S. Batistiana. Marian Antoinette F. Bolo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando P. Bolo. Divine Grace C. Bravo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald V. Bravo. Jamaica Shane F. Bustillo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marville E. Bustillo. Micah May R. Casilla. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon C. Casilla. John Christian A. Colesio. Parent, Mrs. Grace A. Colesio. Josh Abel L. the Twin with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jonicio L. the Twin II. Angelica May C. David with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo L. David. Joanne P. Espinoza. Parents, Mr. Sonny I. Ocampo and Miss Virginia P. Espinoza. Abigail G. Fernandez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel G. Fernandez. Danielle Grace C. Fernandez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick M. Fernandez. Jamaica T. Fernandez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carlito M. Fernandez. Jacqueline M. Flores. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson C. Flores. Orville B. Galgala, high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin P. Gimaya. Nancy G. Hortaleza. Parents, Mr. Fernando C. Hortaleza and Miss Marisa S. Gonzalez. Mark Ruville P. Itable with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roel B. Itable. Laarni Grace C. Honatas with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo P. Honatas. Joseph P. Langi with honors. Parents, Mr. Romeo B. Lumibaw and Miss Noemi P. Langi. Josephine C. Macaraeg with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose C. Macarae. Giselle D.C. Magalong, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jaime E. Magalong. Hazel Angelica M. Mejia, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald F. Mejia. R.G. Brian C. Natividad, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rebel C. Natividad. Anne Margaret P. Orayenza, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar D. Orayenza. Jovelyn B. Pasqua, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Pasqua. Jericho L. Salon, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel C. Salon. Shira B. Season, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benny B. Season. Enaline R. Soriano, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin B. Soriano. Eliza Marie F. Soto, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Juris B. Soto. Myla F. Tantay, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manuel A. Tantay. Rhea E. Tenorio. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto P. Tenorio Jr. Jelly Rose D.C. Yonzaga, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jomar V. Yonzaga.
Here are the graduates of Accountancy, Business, and Management. 12 Bachelor. Advisor, Miss Janica Crizel Abulenci. Arenzon B. Abulenci, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold B. Abulenci. Earl Jesus C. Claverio. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Claverio. Mark Rolin C. Mora. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rizalde Mora. Maria Cristina A. Bardolos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Bardolos. Mariah Trixie Q. Biagtan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renato Biagtan. Fame D. Kalimlim, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Kalimlim. Eliza P. Kalimkim, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnulfo Kalimkim. Marilu P. Calianta, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Calianta. Ira C. Carini, with honors. Parent, Mr. Jackson C. Florence. Stephanie Marie A. Cataylo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jelon Cataylo. Freelin May B. Dacuna, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Dacuna. Jessica May F. Delisa, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Delisa. Christina Marie F. De Vera, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose De Vera. Chat Doriel A. De La Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo De La Cruz. Cariel Ann N. De La Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Enrique De La Cruz. Charlene May T. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Fernandez. Romela Amor C. Flores, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Amormio Flores. Abigail T. Gaviola, with high honors. Parent, Mrs. Mary Jane Gaviola. Zenny Ann A. Gonzalez, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Gonzalez. Jinky G. Conrado, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Enrique Conrado Jr. Gemma Ross S. Pihia, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Mejia. Cherry Ann P. Narvas, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Narvas. Antoinette C. Padilla. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alex Padilla. Edeline O. Paragas, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Paragas. Joanne B. Pasana, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jovito Pasana. Reina May S. Pimentel, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Pimentel. Samantha B. Poseri, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noli Poseri. Aralina G. Ramos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Ramos. Angeline S. Reyes, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armenio Reyes. Rizalyn A. Reyes, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Reyes. Trisha May S. Santos, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Santos. Shaina May C. Segundo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente Segundo. Kristen Joy E. Tinoro. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. George Tinoro. Angeline J. Tigno, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Apring Tigno. Patrice Z. Villanueva, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norman Villanueva. Samantha C. Visperas, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Visperas.
Here are the graduates of Humanities and Social Sciences, 12 Confucius. Advisor, Mr. Christian David U. Andaya. Marvin D. Aquino. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Maximo Aquino. Cedric Rafael C. Bautista, with honors. Parent, Mrs. Lilibeth Bautista. Nigel G. Benito, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Benito. Rafael A. Canubas. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roel Canubas. Jason P. Dion. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Boyet Dion. Kurt L. Fineza, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo Fineza. John Patrick J. Garcia, with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo Garcia. Justin F. Idos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Idos. Jimmy Ray S. Paramo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Paramo. Meljon D.C. Pascual. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino Pascual. John Joel M. Guinness, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Guinness. Robert King S. Samson, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Samson. Danzel A. Soratos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Napoleon Soratos. Oscarito Jr. S. Villanueva, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Oscarito Villanueva Sr. Heidi L. Adiova. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Adiova. Jasmine Grace Ann Levy Aguilar, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Aguilar. Jaira Joy D. Arboleno, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Randy Arboleno. Mary Laika A. Balolo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Larry Balolo. Agnes O. Barberan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Aguido Barberan. Liana May S. Capico, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lemuel Capico. Karel Joy P. Castro, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Diego Castro. Regeline V. Cayabyab, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Cayabyab. Shane Kyla M. Cayabyab, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Cayabyab. Katricia Caril P. Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Canyo Cruz. Sheila May C. Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Cruz. Eliza K. C. de Guzman, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Epifanio de Guzman. Almira P. de Vera, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo de Vera. Jasmine Z. de Vera, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sami de Vera. Daniela P. de la Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo de la Cruz. Raquel C. de la Cruz, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricky de la Cruz. Jane S. de los Santos, with honors. Parent, Mrs. Jeanette de los Santos. Lian R. Espeleta, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruben Espeleta. Princess Joy C. Estrada, with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario Estrada. Gwyneth D. Fernandez, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nestor Fernandez. Juliana Gan, with high honors. Parent, Miss Felicidad Gan. Evelyn S. Ganigan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Ganigan. Genevieve A. Lumontan, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynante Lumontan. Venus A. Mejia. Parent, Mrs. Jeanette Mejia. Christine Joy P. Morales, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Morales. Paula May C. Ocean with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Philip Ocean. Samantha Nicole M. Pagaduan with honors. Parent, Mrs. Rona Pagaduan. Mary Joy V. Parajas with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jojo Parajas. Marionette Rochelle R. Salazar with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolly Salazar. Jimmy Rose D. Solis with honors. Parent, Mrs. Janet Solis. Alexandra May M. Tamayo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Tamayo. Kyla Jane J. Tinto with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Tinto. Diane C. Valdez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Valdez.
Here are the graduates of Humanities and Social Sciences. 12 Erickson. Advisor, Miss Diane Ambrosy. Alejandro T. Andayo with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Andayo. Verly C. Canindino with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Canindino. Links Clifford F. Canto. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mary Grace Fernandez. Raymart D.R. Capo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michelle Capo. James O. Capo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Juliet Capo. Charles Joseph S. Villar with honor. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robel Villar. Joshua Angelo B. Guzman. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario Guzman. Arison B. De Vera. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sonia De Vera. Hubert E. De Vera with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Raquel De Vera. Justin Seth M. Diaz with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Asuncion Diaz. Jerwin D. Duran with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Fuertes. Jiro Sean M. Gabiola with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Gabiola. Ryan P. Garcia with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Delphine Garcia. Timothy John L. Gutierrez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Isagani Gutierrez. Florando D. Lamsen with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Perla Lamsen. Michael J. S. Montero. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Montero. Rayleigh Albert S. Oliero. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Shirley Oliero. Jimboy T. Pauseno. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ben Pauseno. Axel John Cyril C. Paracas. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norma Paracas. Gerald C. Paris with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Glenda Paris. Mac Larry L. Pastoran. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marie Lanon. Bismarck Aaron B. Reyes. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Olivia Reyes. John Dario P. Rosario. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Albino Rosario. John Bernard G. Salazar. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gloria Salazar. Jerick L. Santiago, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anita Santiago. Janeline May A. Aguilar, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jessie Aguilar. Trisha May S. Aquino, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Giraline Aquino. Patricia May B. Balatpan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Violeta Balatpan. Trisha May D. Basa, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Freddie Basa. Jasmine A. Bata, parents, Mr. and Mrs. Annie Bata. Nympha I. Bautista, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Bautista Jr. Mary Jean G. Cabana, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jaisel Cabana. Apple Joy C. Calaunan, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Maria Teresa Calaunan. Jenny Rose A. Carlos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Carlos. Daniela A. Cervantes, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armando Sio. Angelica F. Cordova. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Adonis Cordova. Romela C. Elago, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruel Elago. Blesilda G. Dotto, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bruno Dotto. Rachel Ann P. Fabio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lisa Fabio. Angela Maureen P. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Fernandez. Christine Joy P. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Jose Fernandez. Judy Ann P. Flores, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Virginia Flores. Bernalyn F. Francisco, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernard Francisco. Maria Elizabeth R. Casa, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norberto Casa. Julie Ann M. Rivera, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jocelyn Rivera. Sheena Angelica J. Unatis. Parent, Mrs. Brenda Lee Javines. Zarina K. M. Mabanta, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Mabanta. Katharina R. Maliknem, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Brigida Maliknem. Juliza May B. Maningwing, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rebecca Maningwing. Jezabel F. Libre, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Casimiro Libre Jr. Bernadette B. Ocampo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernard Ocampo. Trisha May Q. Pagaduan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruil Pagaduan. Diana Rose A. Contao, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ida A. Contao. Rina Lynn D. Ranches, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynald Ranches. Eliza B. Reyes, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manolito Reyes. Kristen Grace B. Sales, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. George Sales. Lady Gwyneth B. Sante, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Sante. Princess Diane B. Tabo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Tabo. Princess Hannah B. Cuba, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Cuba. Alpha Grace B. Ventura, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Freddie Ventura. Rachel Gill B. Viernes, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Guillermo Viernes.
Here are the graduates of Humanities and Social Sciences, 12 EJ. Advisor, Mrs. Judy Ann D. Teves. Jeremy B. Aquino. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jessie Aquino. John Rick B. Basa. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Basa. Kim I. Bawega. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Izagani Bawega. Uriel I. Bawega, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Izagani Bawega. Lawrence Ray P. Kalimlim. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ray Kalimlim. J.C. Calmirin, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armand Calmirin. Paul Mark T. Dalope. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Paul Dalope. Hassan John B. De Leon. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny De Leon. Aldrin John G. De La Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo De La Cruz. Mark Hendricks S. De La Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger De La Cruz. Melvin J. C. De La Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Terso De La Cruz. Carlos Miguel V. Gol, with honors. Parent, Mrs. Helen Gol. Rysel G. Isla, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricky Esla. Gomer Bong L. Mamarin. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Mamarin. Krister Ken B. Mamarin, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Mamarin. Jim C. Santos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Santos. John Anthony D. Segundo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Segundo. Russell D. Sumakwe, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Larry Sumakwe. Leonard V. Tamayo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Tamayo. Vladimir G. Arceo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramel Arceo. Crisaline Nova I. Bandong, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rufino Bandong. Judy Ann B. Batalya, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Andy Batalya. Jocelyn C. Bautista. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Bautista Jr. Barbelin C. Benito. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elvis Benito. Beverly May C. Calaksan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Melchor Calaksan. Eileen M. Cancino, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Cancino. Shereen P. Capua, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramilo Capua. Marian Vinaline D. Caraulia, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Melvin Caraulia. Regeline A. Carvajal, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Carvajal. Crystalline B. Cervantes, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto Cervantes. Kiana Nicole N. Corpus. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael Corpus Jr. Sheila May C. Daduya, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolly Daduya. Akira de la Cruz. Parent, Ms. Leoneda de la Cruz. Shane M. de la Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel de la Cruz. Diana Rose C. Eugenio. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Eugenio. Joanna Joyce M. Ivaresto, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gerson Ivaresto. Bernadette A. Florence. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro Florence. Ariana Patrice D. Fontanilla. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Fontanilla. Katrina Ellen O. Casil. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noime Dalope. Erica Joy V. Lubao, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Lubao Jr. Shaina F. Makaalan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norberto Makaalan. Trisha May D. Macaraeg. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renato Macaraeg. Diana D. Magnaan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlui Magnaan. Michelle D. Manangan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cornelio Manangan. Rizenikesh Cyril G. Marquez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Marquez. Krisia Christine F. Natividad. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Natividad. Shira May P. Parapio. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnulfo Parapio. Sarah Jane D. Pasqua, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Pasqua. Anna Frel D. Pasinapo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Pasinapo. Daisy D. Puquinto. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tito Puquinto. Andrea Lou B. Quinto, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bonifacio Quinto. Joy G. Quinto, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pablo Quinto. Renaline M. Segundo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rex Segundo. Judith S. Soriano. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Soriano. Rosette Ann D. Sulit, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rosaulo Sulit. Laika A. Talamildo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joselito Talamildo. Bridget O. Tamayo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jamaro Tamayo. Jersel Ann O. Talignikan. Parent, Mrs. Jonaline Kapadpan. Shira May B. Tenorio. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Tenorio. Mary Joy C. Ugay, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manolito Ugay. Chonaline D. Valdez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Valdez. Christine May T. Valyada. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Valyada. Hyacinth Bea M. Ventura, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Crescencio Ventura.
Here are the graduates of Humanities and Social Sciences, 12 Socrates. Advisor, Mr. John Hope S. Centenior. Dikis E. Aguilar, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fernando Aguilar. Jello B. Abulencio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Abulencio. William James M. Bautista, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manny Bautista. Earl Ryan P. Bugawa, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Bugawa. John Riel A. Canto, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruel Canto. Alfred B. Calimino, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo Calimino. Christian Ken F. Campos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Napoleon Campos. Lowen A. Castillo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Castillo. Ken Chester P. Cooley, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Rene Boy Cooley. Joshua G. Laguya. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodel Laguya. A.J. Iverson Q. Licano, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alan Licano. John Christian Paul G. Redino, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Anthony Redino. Jacqueline O. Galiste, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Herman Galiste. John Joshua P. Justina, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Florencio Justina. John Julfred C. Nicolas, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo Nicolas. MC Dave Leo B. Parents, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo Parents. Armin C. Iliopas, with honors. Mr. and Mrs. Arielito Iliopas. Edward Clarence B. Kim, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Pinto. Dariel A. Seraon, with honors.
Mrs. Virginia Saraon.
Alec John S. Valdez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ariel Valdez. Jemima C. Aguilar. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benji Aguilar. Ana Purita D.C. Alvarez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Alvarez. Winnie Gwen L. Aybar, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Aybar. Oria May M. with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Aquino. Shermay E. Banique, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo Banique. Marilyn S. Mauzo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ariel Mauzo. Diana E. Hawili, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Catalino Hawili. Abigail C. Castillo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gideon Castillo. Diana Marie O. Cayabyab, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Cayabyab. Rochelle L. Oro, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rubencio Oro. Bridget Gail L. Guzman, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. J.D. Guzman. Rochelle Ann O. Jesus. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry De Jesus. Ira C. Fernandez, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Fernandez. Liv Garrett B. Butani. Parents, Mr. Loreto Filipe. Maria Hannah Joy L. Mandongan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Mandongan. Dane Marie C. Miralles, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Miralles. Maria Jesusa S. Ocampo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Ocampo. Jane Austin B. Peralta, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Peralta. Cheryl C. Peralta, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Peralta. Frankie Nicole A. Ramos, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Ramos. Bernadette Rachel B. Santos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gracie Santos. Joanne Santillan, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Ramos Jr. Christina Zay Sucamino, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Sucamino.
Here are the graduates of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, 12 Celsius. Advisor, Mr. Renz C. Ferrer. Adrian R. Apoy with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Apoy. Leoj Aldrich O. Aguilar with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Aguilar. Aaron Joshua S. Bagtad with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Abraham Bagtad. Kian Edmond C. Bautista with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edmundo Bautista. Zeus T. Burgilios with honors. Parent, Mrs. Maria Consuelo Burgilios. Ray Jason M. Caspillan with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Giovanni Caspillan. Justin A. Corpus with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Corpus. Michael John A. Cruz with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricky Cruz. Alnir S. Erme. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Erme. Joshua Elohim T. Ferrer with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norman Ferrer. Clyde Irene T. Macaraeg. Parent, Mrs. Flordelisa Macaraeg. Leoandro Gino B. Manlongan with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armando Manlongan. Nico Hill Josh I. Montemayor. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Montemayor. Jerry M. Nahera with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ropito Nahera. Mark Jimuel L. Pontawe with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Pontawe. Rex G. N. Pontawe with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Pontawe. James Paul C. Ramirez with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Ramirez. John Mark C. Reyes with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino Reyes. Andre Yestan C. Shapno with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro Shapno. Gio N. Tantay with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manu Tantay. Von Riley P. Valiente with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renan Valiente. Daisy Rose T. Alvarez with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danielle Alvarez. Jovel Ann B. Bangsal with honors. Parent, Ms. Vilma Bangsal. Abigail C. Baniken with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Baniken. Hannah Bea J. Benito with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Benito. Jirel Denise M. Cruz with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gaudencio Cruz. Karen D. Cruz with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tirso Cruz. Karil Lian V. Francisco with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Francisco. K. Diana Rose V. Logan with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alex Logan. Maria Daniela Rose M. Montemayor with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Juquil Sherry Montemayor. Maria Ederling Quinto, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edalberto Quinto. Tricia May I. Quinto, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Almer Quinto. Jenny M. Tabilin, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Tabilin. Here are the graduates of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. 12 Fahrenheit. Advisor, Mrs. Marilu M. Surot. Ralph Vincent V. Abalos, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon Abalos. Rostely A. Abawag, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Raydante Abawag. Louis Matthew T. Anten, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. William Maninding Anten. Jake A. Arbo, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Arbo. Ralph Tristan R. Bruan, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael Bruan. Elvin June B. Bugayong, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Bugayong. Gerald Christian Dave P. Cabrera. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. German H. Cabrera. Jamarlu S. Kalimlim, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Apolio Kalimlim. Mark Ken G. Capua, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario G. Capua. John Wilke B. Kayabia, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo S. Kayabia. Rod Joseph F. Cervantes, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo P. Cervantes. BJ G. Cuadro, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernabe Cuadro. Jericho D. De Leon, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Santiago De Leon. Derek Rosal V. Dumondon, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Revilla Dumondon. Francis Carl Dumandan, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eranio D. Aquino. John Carlos D.C. Gabrilio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bobby Bustillo Gabrilio. Rafael G. Iglesias, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Erickson V. Iglesias. Joshua S. Loresco, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Oliver L. Loresco. John Daryl I. Marcos, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin M. Marcos. Jimuel Kit D. Mula, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Job Cardozo Mula. Danrive Eric S. Noche, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roderick F. Noche. Renzo V. Poto, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renante Etang Poto. Carl Jordan F. with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander R. Villafania. John Stephen D. Yambao, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Crispino Q. Yambao. Mark Daniel C. Zapanta, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Zapanta. Desiree Joy V. Abuan with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benito Abuan. Renabel P. Bravo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger S. Bravo. Justin Reds B. Barberon with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Barberan. Eliza Geraldine Cristina P. Cabrera with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sherman H. Cabrera. Ira Joy T. De Vera with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny Paragas De Vera. Jana A. De Vera with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny De Vera. Jennifer P. De Vera with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus O. De Vera. Jasmine S. Flores with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roldan Mandapat Flores.
Here are the graduates of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. 12 Calvin. Advisor, Mr. Welland A. Tamayo Jr. Gwyneth P. Alacar with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Livy Alacar. Sherilyn D. Apadre with high honors. Parents, Mr. Chofilo Z. Apalia Jr. Aliana O. Balansay with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Balansay. Gwyneth Jill C. Ballesteros with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Genaro M. Ballesteros. Jed Knight Oman with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Papamoman. Joey C. Dam Jr. with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joey B. Kakdak Sr. Mark Razel G. Kayabiao with high honors. Parents, Mrs. Marivic G. Kayabiao. Precious J. V. Cervantes with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. J. S. Cervantes. Adrian J. V. Cruz with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey Z. Cruz. Dominic G. Cruz with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Domingo S. Cruz. Zoila Samantha G. Cruz with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo B. Cruz Jr. Artsy April P. Dacasi with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur S. Dacasi. Luis Dancel M. De Jesus with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Diosdado C. De Jesus. John Allen U. Francisco with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Willie A. Francisco. Eliza Joyce A. Gumawi with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold F. Gumawi. Caterina Don P. Loresco with high honors. Parent, Mrs. Maria Verena E. Loresco. Lem Iris Loresco with highest honors. Parent, Miss Evangeline M. Loresco. Ralph Christian P. Mabanta with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael R. Mabanta. Vinjo D.V. Mamorno with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vincent C. Mamorno. Trisha Kate A. Mangasa with high honors. Parent, Mrs. Geraldine A. Mangasa. Raisin C. Mayo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo L. Mayo Jr. Jingle G. Montemayor with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Glenn P. Montemayor. Michael C. Peralta with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Peralta. Jericho V. Perez with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renato D.V. Perez. Reka Abigail B. Vietnam with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Corate T. Vietnam. Julianne N. Cleopas with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand B. Cleopas. Julia May M. Ronquillo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. J. O. Ronquillo. Hannah Trisha Micaela S. Saludes with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cesar J. Saludes. Sophia Marie D.G. Shao with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fernando F. Shao. Menchi Aljane G. Taluna with high honors. Parents, Mrs. Janelle G. Taluna. John Robert M. Tamayo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto B. Tamayo. Ken Cedric R. Tamayo with high honors. Parent, Mrs. Loisa R. Tamayo. Kate Therese T. Taro with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arturo A. Taro Jr. Micaela C. Tejada with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arvin P. Tejada. Munet Josa A. Villanueva with highest honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manny Villanueva. Here are the graduates of Technical, Vocational, and Livelihood, Bakery, Food and Beverages. 12 Crudite. Advisor, Mr. Jasper B. White. Mark Daryl L. Antalan. With honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael J. Antalan. Rance R. Busa. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Busa. John Robert B. Cervantes. With honors. Parent, Mrs. Patricia B. Cervantes. Mark G. Iglesias. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael T. Iglesias. Mark Daniel V. Jimenez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Melesio Jimenez. Renato Z. Navarro. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cesar O. Navarro. Jumel B. Perez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario M. Perez. John Richard M. Quinto. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Quinto. Daniel V. Sabangan. With honors. Parent, Mrs. Donalyn V. Sabangan. Jimmy T. Senin Jr. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Senin. Lester Simon S. Tallison. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel S. Tallison. Carls Ryzen M. Hood. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny D. Hood. Daniel S. Villanueva. Parents, Mrs. Loretta S. Villanueva. Catherine C. Abrigo. With honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alberto C. Abrigo. Aliena Chesga E. Aguilar. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco T. Aguilar. Kyla U. Brandia. With honors. Parent, Mrs. Milia U. Constantino. Ronald Bea C. Caranto with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pablo D. Caranto. Dinalyn L. Karcha. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nafi Z. Karcha. Jenny Joy T. Carino with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador D. Carino. Raisa May I. De Leon. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Grayson L. De Leon. Asia Brianna A. De La Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Q. De La Cruz. Melody B. De Los Santos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario B. De Los Santos. Rachel Ann Dino. Parent, Mrs. Merly C. Dino. Mary Rose P. Duon. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mira P. Duon. Rochelle O. Ferialde. Parent, Mrs. Lourdes O. Ferialde. Mary Jane D. Fernandez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Q. Fernandez. Sarah F. Flores. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rene P. Flores. Chami C. Gomez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo C. Gomez. Madeline A. Lictawa. Parent, Mrs. Mary Jane A. Lictawa. Julianne D. Manuel. Parent, Mrs. Melba D. Manuel. Anna F. Mainigo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Remeo F. Mainigo. Evangeline M. Mondirino. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo D. Mondirino. Pearly Ann M. Osilia. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fabi S. Osilia. Jasmine M. Puntawe. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Puntawe. Jonalyn S. Salinga. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel S. Salinga. Kyla May S. Valdez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger E. Valdez. Bea N. Versailles with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon P. Versailles. Jinky T. Zarate. Parent, Mrs. Aurora T. Zarate. Christine Fe P. Zulueta. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto.
Here are the graduates of Technical Vocational Livelihood, Cookery, BPP, FBS, 12 Ordeval. Advisor, Mrs. April V. Gargarita. John Pederick Official. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jocelyn Official. John Dexter D.C. Arboleda. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Arboleda. Brendan Jason E. Ailar. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Abad Ailar. Jeff Ryan I. Bruan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Bruan. Romar B. de los Reyes. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel de los Reyes. Danielle I. De Vera. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danny De Vera. Henry M. De La Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo De La Cruz. Jonathan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo Pascual. Ulysses F. Puntawe. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Puntawe. Jimuel B. Tamayo with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renato Tamayo. Paul Joshua C. Ungos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael Ungos. Marivic C. Abala. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Abala. Rochelle V. Ballesteros. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynold Ballesteros. Joyce G. Buloy, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Buloy. Edeline G. Kalimkim, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nika T. Fernandez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny Fernandez. Alariza D.V. Garcia. Parent, Mrs. Luzviminda Garcia. Princess M. Lopez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nino Lopez. Ashley Ann S. Ocean. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rudy Ocean. Michelle D. Padilla. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Padilla. Rhea May B. Palaganas, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Palaganas. Ronaline L. Pontawe. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Pontawe. Angeline D. Ramos, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael Ramos. Ann Bea B. Rebualos, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Rebualos. Jezabel S. Reyes. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar Reyes. Angela F. Rumbawa, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Angelo Rumbawa. Angeline H. Sabo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Sabo. Maria Joyce E. Santos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Santos. Rizaline P. Segundo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rene Segundo. Pauline B. Socorro, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Socorro. Jamaica D. Soriano. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Narlito Soriano. Larice C. Soriano, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carla Soriano.
Here are the graduates of Technical, Vocational, and Livelihood, Hairdressing. 12 TVL C2 Hairdressing. Advisor, Mrs. Maricel S. Gonzalez. Miriam C. Castillo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jolie R. Castillo. Jonaline M. Dalope. Guardian, Mrs. Virginia F. Dalope. Angeline E. Espinoza. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony E. Espinoza. Janice B. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nestor R. Fernandez. Marie S. Montoya. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo P. Montoya. Jam Bea T. Reyes. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo A. Reyes. Rosel R. Salayo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando D. Salayo. Jamaica M. Segundo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John L. Segundo. Mary Joy R. Segundo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jaime S. Segundo. Regine S. Segundo. With honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rufo S. Segundo. Maylene N. Somera. With honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Federico S. Somera. Rain Sheena A. Soriano. With honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo H. Soriano. Shannon Eliza D. Soriano. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo S. Soriano. Mylene G. Valio. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon A. Valio. Rochelle C. Villa. With honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo P. Villa.
Here are the graduates of Technical Vocational Livelihood, Computer System Servicing, 12 Linux. Advisor, Mr. Neil Patrick C. Manuel. 1 Miguel A. Almacen, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alvin G. Almacen. Michael M. Ballesteros, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Maki C. Ballesteros. Maku G. Bernardino. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tomas Bernardino. Stephen Joshua G. Kapinpin, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joey Kapinpin. Reggie V. Kayabyab. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Kayabyab. Dave Francis F. Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Cruz. Jeffrey M. De La Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo De La Cruz. Alan F. Diaz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Diaz. JVR Dion, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Junjun Dion. Kevin D.C. Ellis, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pablito Ellis. Kurt Justin T. Fabito. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Fabito. Mark Joshua B. Gakura, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Gakura. Mikey Jones Hunatas. Parent, Mrs. Mylene Hunatas. Chevy Bon S. Limos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Limos. J.L. Dominic S. Malasan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo Malasan. Russell Ken D.G. Manuel. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Manuel. Emmanuel P. Mendoza. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario Mendoza. Orlando Jr. S. Panigbatan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Orlando Panigbatan Sr. Mark John Gray G. Paraan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gary Paraan. Reden F. Peros. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Peros. Mark Robin T. Puserio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario Poserio. Michael John C. Poserio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. David Poserio. John Eric F. Privado. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Privado. Simon Dave O. Solomon. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Solomon. Ranzel A. Tantay, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alan Tantay. J. Angelo M. Valdez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jason Valdez. Robert Jr. T. Vesperaz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Vesperaz Sr. Karen Angel C. Kalimlim. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario Kalimlim. Paula Colleen A. Kalimlim, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Florante Kalimlim. Francine Ann L. Kalimkim, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Kalimkim. Christine Ann M. Castillo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Gumawi. Maria Bernadette C. Joaquin, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Joaquin. Rochelle R. Jungay, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joselito Jungay. Fatima T. Junio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Federico Junio Jr. Mika May A. Mamaradlo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Mamaradlo. Melody O. Olarte, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Peter Olarte. Angel Rose T. Oraza. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jessie Oraza. Jenaline T. Relora. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ray Relora. Roseanne M. Rosario, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. George Rosario. Angelica A. Sarmiento. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Sarmiento. Nikki Joy C. Tamayo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Tamayo. Hannah Laika E. Tindoy. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Tindoy. Here are the graduates of Technical Vocational Livelihood Computer System Servicing, 12 Windows. Advisor, Mrs. Shelmin Kate C. Manuel. Joseph V. Ambrosio. Parent, Mrs. Rachel Valio. Joe Mark U. Arenas. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mercury Arenas. Marvin M. Barrera, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Justado Barbera. Christian J. C. Bolasok, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Art Bolasok. Joseph Son P. Bruan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Orlando Bruan. Jefferson C. Cabrera. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Cabrera. Kevin J. S. Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elpidio Cruz. Vian Daryl C. Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Octaviano Cruz. Hans D.C. Dalope. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romy Dalope. John Kenneth C. Dalugdog. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Winifredo Dalugdog. Raymond S. De La Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo De La Cruz. Roger Jr. A. De Los Santos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger De Los Santos. Aaron S. Diaz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Diaz. Darwin Q. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eddie Fernandez. Rolly O. Flores, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Flores. Yuan Lexi C. Gutay, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chris John Gutay. Mark Jansen D.S. Lequanan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sergio Lequanan. John Rake D.C. Lemos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricarte Lemos. Cyrus J. A. Mabanta, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Mabanta. Joshua H. Mandapat, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jason Mandapat. Ashley A. Manuel. Parent, Mrs. Mary Chris Manuel. Eric Christian B. Morano. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sunny Morano. Gimar Orazi, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Ilon. Julius Cesar D. Palaganas, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino Palaganas. Rogelio Jr. S. Palaganas, with honors. Parent, Mrs. Lorena Palaganas. Japer A. Paraan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Paraan Jr. Jomel C. Rosario. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romel Rosario. Mark Anthony D.C. Santiago, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Santiago. Chester Adelbert P. Sarza, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Macanlalay. Ace B. Tenorio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Terry Tenorio. Jofel V. Valdez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Felizardo Valdez Jr. Mary Chu P. Agsalod, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Agsalod. Micaela May N. Capua. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar Capua. Bernadette R. Dagarag, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bebot Dagarag. Sheila May T. Estipolar, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romualdo Estipolar. Rosaline B. Fabito. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Fabito. Chelsea Zina F. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Shalmanazer Fernandez. Jodelia V. Fernandez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jody Fernandez. Joy Kyla S. Idos with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nicanor Idos. Sheila Operania with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Operania. Myla Joy P. Rendon. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tranquilino Rendon Jr. Princess Dailin S. Ripa. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bonifacio Ripa. Lyra May P. Tulao with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Laurencio Tulao. Lady Lynn S. Ugay with high honors. Parents,
Here are the graduates of Technical, Vocational, and Livelihood, Computer Systems Servicing, 12 Macintosh. Advisor, Mrs. Nanijoy F. Batistian. John Andrew P. Arenas. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph R. Arenas. Leandro C. Arenas with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino V. Arenas. Sherwin John C. Arenas. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto P. Arenas. Lawrence C. Ballesteros with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Ballesteros. Marvin Charles B. Bartek. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario C. Bartek. Christian Noel T. Bolinas II with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noel L. Bolinas. J.B. C. Buenaluz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Emmanuel A. Buenaluz. Jordan N. Karaman with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Zaldi V. Karaman. Dick B. Collado. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Collado. Stephen Carl B. Cruz with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto B.J. Cruz. J.V.M. Grencho. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Grencho. Lester S. Idos with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rosario B. Idos. Jandrix Clint B. Illumin. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo P. Illumin. Christian P. Limos with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher D. Limos. Jerson A. Lopez with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry D. Lopez. Romel N. Macaraeg with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo V. Macaraeg. Miguel S. Malapitan with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruelito C. Malapitan. John Darrell P. Mandapa with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gary C. Mandapa. Kenneth P. Narvas with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Z. Narvas. Mark Jeffrey F. Olimpiado with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Junie B. Olimpiado. Mark J.C.F. Olimpiado with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Junie B. Olimpiado. Darrell C. Palaganas with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wardy V. Palaganos. John Paul E. Paraan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carlito C. Paraan. Mark Jerome C. Paraino, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael R. Paraino. Randall T. Ramos, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Ramos. Elijah P. Sadiaza, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christian L. Sadiaza. June Clyde E. Sangalang. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernardino B. Sangalang. Mike Denver C. Santos. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Enrique Santos. Jennifer M. Salvino Jr. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jennifer Salvino Sr. Claire Alain G. Suarez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armando Suarez. Jarek N. Taluban. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John B. Taluban. Jude Michael C. Taluban. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jomar G. Taluban. Kyla E. Adupa, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jim J. Adupa. Shirley A. Ballesteros. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Saudi I. Ballesteros. Crystal Ann C. Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bienvenido R. Cruz. Kyla May C. De Dios. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Zaudi N. De Dios. Mallory Co. De Vera. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Donata D. De Vera. Dea Bianca J. Fernandez, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dominador N. Fernandez. Ira P. Francisco. Parents, Mrs. Carmelita C. Paraan. Kyla May D. Malana, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Delia Malana. Diana May R. Montuya, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alex Montuya. Justin Luis P. Poserio, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Poserio. Jonathan N. Cleopas, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand P. Cleopas. Jessica R. Segundo, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Judith M. Segundo. Angela H. Taloban, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio S. Taloban. Blue Miles D.L. Tapiador, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bartolome M. Tapiador. Yvonne Marie G. Villafania. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bonnie Villafania.
Here are the graduates of Technical, Vocational, and Livelihood, Electrical, Installation, and Maintenance. 12 Faraday. Advisor, Mr. Roderick M. Disperat. Jeffrey A. Abolencia. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry B. Abolencia. RV F. Aguilar, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arturo M. Aguilar. John Roy M. Almoite, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto C. Almoite. Joshua T. Carino, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador D. Carino. Alan D.V. Daduya, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benito P. Daduya. Ronald M. De Guzman. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rufo A. De Guzman. Jeric N. De Leon, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tito De Leon. John Lloyd S. De Nieva, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. George S. De Nieva. Ryzen Kurt De Nieva, with honors. Parents, Miss Marilu S. De Nieva. Jericho J. De La Cruz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roderick C. De La Cruz. John Klein E. De Solo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny C. De Solo. Christopher P. Diaz, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo M. Diaz. Mark P. Favros, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario A. Favros. Joseph D.V. Mandapan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose C. Mandapan. Paulo M. Mandapan. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leopoldo C. Mandapan. Michael D.C. Manluktao. Parent, Miss Lilia D.C. Manluktao. Chody M. Muero, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Loreto D. Muero. Bernard S. Quinto, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo M. Quinto. Jidri D.G. Ramas, with honors. Parents, Miss Dorina G. Ramas. Rinel A. Sambo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson P. Sambo. Marlon F. Samson, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Merlo C. Samson. Alvin C. Santiago. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodel M. Santiago. Aljan L. Sarmiento. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Astrobal R. Sarmiento. Jonathan F. Taluban. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Genaro S. Taluban Jr. Rafael C. Tindoy. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Raul C. Tindoy. Ramil S. Torres, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando A. Torres. Mark James M. Villanueva, with high honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Zarex F. Villanueva.
Here are the graduates of Technical Vocational Livelihood, Electrical Installation and Maintenance, 12 OM. Advisor, Mr. Loreto D. Manluktao. James Peter F. Aguilar. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Aguilar. Sammy M. Seralde. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Seralde. Mark Devin D. Cervantes. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Cervantes. Mark Angelo A. Claveria. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Claveria. Noriel C. Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Ariel Cruz. Mark Vincent B. de Guzman. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger M. de Guzman. Leonard S. de la Cruz. Parent, Mrs. Marilyn de la Cruz. Ronald Allen B. de la Cruz. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald de la Cruz. Brian D. Disoyo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Disoyo. Christian N. Fabito. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arturo Fabito. Raymark B. Fernandez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rufo Fernandez. Alberto D. Gumawid. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Gumawid. Joshua M. Junilas. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Junilas. Mario Jr. B. Lopez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario Lopez Sr. Joomar D. Manawis. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Manawis. Bonray V. Martinez. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricky Martinez. Henry G. Montemayor. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Crispin Montemayor. Benedict M. Montoya. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Montoya. Leadris C. Morante, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rick Morante. Patrick V. Norioste. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramil Norioste. Joey P. Padilla. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Padilla. Renzon A. Sambo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Sambo. Joey A. Sarmiento. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Victorio Sarmiento. Marshall T. Sullivan, with honors. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Sullivan. Lester Harvey O. Tamayo. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Tamayo. Manuel James G. Te. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manolito Te. Mark Brian C. Villa. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bonnie Villa. J. Mark L. Villafana. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Orlando Villafana. Danielle Jr. M. Villar. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danielle Villar Sr. The message of our municipal mayor, Architect Joel F. De Los Santos.
Maabig dan masayaksat ya agaw, Daniel Maramba National High School. Congratulations sa lahat ng nagsisitapos ngayong araw. Ito ay isang partikular na taon para sa ating lahat. Dulot na rin ng pandemya. Ngunit ako ay nagagalak dahil hindi ito naging hadlang para magpatuloy ang school year na ito. Nagpapasalamat ako sa mga magulang at guro na walang asawang pinapatnubayan ang ating pag-aaral. Angkop ang temang kalidad ng edukasyon lalong patatagin sa gitna ng pandemya sapagkat naniniwala ako na sa pamamagitan ng online learning at technology ay mas nagiging holistic ang development ng mga estudyante dahil mas nakuha rin ang kanilang pagiging maparaan, malikhain at madiskarte. Tumaas din ang health awareness at disaster resilience hindi lamang ng mga mag-aaral, kundi pati na rin ang bawat isa sa atin. Patunay ito ang kaalaman at pagkatuto ay hindi lamang confined sa 4 na sulok ng silid-aralan. Sa panahon din ng krisis na tulad ng pandemic, umuusbong ang pagbabayanihan at pagdadamayan, ang networking at community engagement. Napapalalim ang ating pakikipagkapwa ng tao at volunteerism. We may be physically distant, but we are obviously socially connected. Nariyan ang patuloy na naglulungkot bilang mayor, ang local government unit at local school board sa pag-agapay sa Department of Education sa pamamagitan ng pagpapatupad ng educational infrastructure support projects and provision of gadgets and non-normal aids. Makaparaanan para masabayan ang matulungan maitawid ang ating mga kabataan sa pagkatuto patungo sa new normal. Kahanga-hanga pinapakita ng katatagan, creativity and innovativeness ng bawat isa. Despite this volatile, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous times brought by COVID-19. Sa ganang akin, nabati ko ang lahat ng bumubuo ng Daniel Maramba National High School at community partners sa tagumpay ng nasana ng mga school year. Buhay po kayo, buhay po tayong lahat, patayin po tayo. Maraming salamat.
The message of PTA President Mr. Nelson Alexander Tamayo.
Good day and mabuhay. I would like to begin recognizing our respected principal, Madam Olivia P. Tirado, with her assistant principal, Ma'am Melissa Pinlac, our teachers, our lecturers, to all the hardworking faculty and staff, my co-parents, dedicated graduates, whom I have witnessed first-hand display their resilience and perseverance amidst these unpredictable times. I have the honor to speak on the behalf of parents and to represent some of our thoughts and reflection on the happy occasion of seeing our daughters and son graduate from Daniel Maramba National High School. I feel so incredibly proud of you all for being fearless in facing all obstacles from this year's in spite this pandemic. On behalf of PTA, I would like to extend my warmest congratulations to this year's 2020-2021 graduates and thank you for your dedication and enthusiasm to pursue your goal despite this very challenging, difficult time we are facing globally. We as PTA, we will be your partner in all your endeavor. We will work hand in hand to continue achieving everyone's dream and strengthen the quality of education amid this pandemic. We will do our part and do our best to support and cooperate in all school programs and activities to promote quality education that our children deserve. Kudos to our young generation. Soar high. May God bless you all and keep us all safe. Thank you very much.
Words of gratitude of this batch with highest honors. Ralph Christian B. Mabantang.
I still can't believe that I made this far because of limits. Limits. I was surrounded by limits. Way back when I decided to take online classes, I first thought about my limits, asking myself, what could my scenarios be? What could become of me in online classes? Limits when it comes to financial, emotional, space, courage, and a lot more limits. Favorite, the iconic rows of roosters. Anyway, kidding aside, there are times that I have to go to other places in order to record physical activities. Gadgets and other necessary equipment are also a limit, not only for me, but for other students as well. Doing activities and assignments in online classes require specific equipment and utilities like laptops, camera, and internet. Another fan favorite is the most memorable unmute icon. Basically, if it is turned off, for instance you were called to recite, it limits you to provide answers because teachers cannot hear you. Limits are also countless. It may differ from person to person. It is already what we possess. It shows how imperfect and unique we people are. One memorable limit thing while taking online classes is the challenge of rendering services to the students and spearheading advocacies in a pandemic. As a Supreme Student Government President, it is not an easy job to juggle academics and service at the same time. I remember the sleepless nights due to planning of activities and preparations for different kinds of events, advocacies, and partnerships. Aside from the support of my family, a dose of Copico Blanca was my all-time companion. Another thing is the fun limit we have. Budgeting and making budget proposals were also difficult. However, no matter how difficult it is, the smiles of people whom we've helped are priceless and worthwhile. Whenever I lack of what I need, whenever limit restricts me, I usually run to people who have them. Likewise, to people who lack it, I provide what I have to suffice their needs. I realize while studying in an online modality, we make our ends meet. This satisfies the old but gold quote, no man is an island. Helping each other is what we currently need, especially in this pandemic. We need each other's ability and resources to reach our goals. These limits we have can become a key of awakening greater capacities. Like what Asta and Yanni in the anime Black Clover do, they surpass their limits. They fill in each other's incapacities. They use their resources to make ends meet. Well, this is one way to convert our incapacities to opportunities to grow. Of course, these limits cannot be surpassed without the help and support of my family, Carl, Andrew, Ella, Mami Josie, and Daddy Alex, and especially to my mommy and daddy who always say na kayang-kaya mo yan and magpahinga ka rin minsan, may doktor na tayo, or even in actions, I feel your love, effort, and sacrifice for me. To my classmates, Inten Diamond, STEM Kelvin and Wat J, my friends, cohorts, Lapag-Lapag, Aircon, and other unnamed groups, my church family, youth organizations, teachers, and my advisors, especially Sir Jonathan Aquino, Ma'am Marife Overo, Ma'am Delia Kayanan, Ma'am Rosalina Maningbin, and my senior high school advisor, Sir Wellan A. Tamayo. If ever I could write a book containing my words of gratitude, I would take years to write it. And to the authorities, namely Dr. Ellie S. Ubaldo, OIC Superintendent, Dr. Diana C. Baguio, our PSBS, Dr. Olivia P. Tirado, our school principal, Ma'am Melissa Pinlock, our assistant principal, and all department heads. To all the students and others who are currently watching, as we take the next step in fulfilling our dreams, let me say padayon and strive until we can say, I still can't believe that I made this far in spite of limits. Happy graduation, Batch 2021. God bless us all, and to God be the glory.
The closing remarks of our Assistant Principal, Ms. Melissa C. Pinlock.
A victorious day to everyone. Kudos to all graduates of Batch 2021. The toil of your labor has been successfully pursued. Now is just the beginning of the journey. Whether to enter college with a level skills, entrepreneur, or venture in the world of work. Graduates, the choice is yours. I would like to commend my colleagues, today's frontliners in the educative process. They nurtured and inspired me to be knowledgeable, skilled, and equipped with values. Ang 6 na taong pakikibaka sa sekundarya ay ganap na. Kaya't maalab na pagpupugay sa mga magulang bilang kaagapay tuwina sa gitna ng pandemya. Marapat lamang na sa formal na pagtatapos ng ating virtual graduation ay muling maipaabot sa lahat mula sa buong kabuuan ng Daniel Maramba National High School sa pamumuno ng ating guro, Dr. Olivia P. Tirado, ang taus-pusong pasasalamat. Mabuhay ang Batch 2021. Pagpalain nawa ang lahat ng poong may kapal.
And I had a dream that someday I would just fly away. And I always knew I couldn't stay. So I had a dream that I'd just fly away. I've been on my own for a minute. Is it only me out there? Searching for the place to begin it. Is it me? Is it you? Is it fear? Standing on the line I was given. People stare and ask me why I'm here. No one seems to think that I fit in, but I don't wanna be like them. No, 'cause I don't wanna be like them. 'Cause I know that I had a dream that someday I would just fly away. And I always knew I couldn't stay.